Unmute. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's podcast. I'm Chloe Tetro. I am the health coach here with Ready Care. And for this evening's chat, we will be looking at something that I mentioned quite a bit in talks that I give. And I thought, gee, because you know what? Maybe we should do a little bit of an in-depth, because sometimes I tend to mention things and maybe go into them a little bit more to really show back up for this evening session. We'll be looking at the prefrontal cortex, which is something that I mentioned quite a bit in different webinars that I would give. And we'll just take a little bit of a dive as to what it is, what's involved, the specific roles that it has, and why it is important to keep up the engagement with it, and think of it like a muscle that you can fortify and strengthen. Just checking in the comment section. Good evening, Beverly Underwood. How are you? And guys, at any point, if anybody wants to drop any messages in the old comment section, go for it. Now, so let us get started with the old prefrontal cortex. So what is the prefrontal cortex? It is part of your brain. It's a multi-association part of the brain, which is involved in planning, recent memory, abstraction. So things like active imagination, things like future projection of something. So beyond where you are now, whenever you engage your active imagination to think beyond that situation, you're working the old prefrontal cortex. It also helps with categorizing information. So it plays a very central role in forming goals, which is very, very important when you're looking at making any behavioral and lifestyle changes, and looks at breaking that goal down into objectives when you're looking to create your plan of action. So it's responsible for organizing things, the time involved, and the cause and effect of consideration. What I would usually give as a primary example for this is you're sitting down to-do list for the day. As soon as you sit down and go, what do I have to do today? You're engaging your prefrontal cortex. You're thinking of the activities you have. You're thinking of what's time sensitive, what's energy sensitive, and looking at an order. So if you imagine the prefrontal cortex as your ongoing to-do list, it's sometimes called the executive or the CEO of the brain. And where the executive comes in is actually just as simple as executive function, which is exactly what this would be. Ordering tasks, deciding which one comes at which point, and kind of the logic associated with that. So it's located in the anterior, so the front part of the cerebral cortex, on the frontal lobes. Now, something to remember and keep in mind, about the prefrontal cortex, God, is it has a very limited energy source and becomes tired quite easily. So there's different little parts, and what I'll do is I'll just give an all breakdown of the specific parts in it, just so you can see really the roles and the real fullness of what's involved with the prefrontal cortex. Because sometimes looking at it as an executive component of the brain is quite reductive, and you could really be able to see all of the amazing things that it does. So there's different parts. There's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that one is your executive function, which we mentioned, planning, short-term memory, cognitive abilities, abstract reasoning, so that active imagination, attention, which is a big one, and inhibition, so that kind of impulse control. The impulse control aspect is actually the last part that matures into adulthood. So you would kind of ask yourself sometimes, how is it that teenagers and young adults have zero impulse control? Well, maybe it's not their fault. You have the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and that is timely, appropriate decision making. So that shift of, maybe I should put that first. Okay, all of these tasks involve me being out of the house. This one's going to take longer. I'm going to put it at the front of the day because it is going to take up more energy. All of these types of timely response aspects would be the dorsomedial part. It also helps us to form judgment and establish a sense of identity, which are quite biggies. They're biggies. They would be kind of, how do you take in the external information and internalize it to think, oh yeah, I'm the type of person who, whatever it might be. You have the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and that again would be impulse control and helps to kind of control dominant behaviors. Massive part in goal direction behavior. So all of these are interplaying. So with any aspect of the brain, it's not as if like it's as hard and fast as this part of the brain does this part of the brain does that, because it's so interrelated. There's so many networks in the brain. And actually people who have had specific brain injuries that damages a particular part of the brain, sometimes the rest of the brain will take those tasks and reorder them. It's an absolutely amazing organ, but you can see how there's a little bit of interplay between all of those aspects of it. You have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and that one would be, excuse me, interpreting situations to look at appropriate decisions. So let's say that you're in a social situation and somebody says to you, oh, you should call over later. But their face kind of gives you the impression that maybe you shouldn't really call over later. It's that kind of decision making with the information that you have in front of you. That's a very crude example just off the top of my head, but being able to assess information that you're given and weighing up whether it's the right decision or the wrong decision. You also have the orbitofrontal cortex, which is right behind the eyeballs, hence the orbital. And again, that would be a long-term reward assessment. So what you're seeing a lot of in all of these parts of the brain is really that kind of overlook that it's more than just your current situation. It's assessing time-based, something beyond where you find yourself at the moment, and things that have a knock-on effect for the long term for you. So you can see how maintaining a good relationship with the prefrontal cortex, especially if you're making specific changes to your habits and your lifestyle, has a massive part to play and has a really huge knock-on effect. So that brings us to, I call it the adversary, but that's very dramatic of me, the basal ganglia. So why is it, if we have the prefrontal cortex and we are capable of making all these types of decisions, why is it that we sometimes veer back to our old friend, unhelpful habits? So with the basal ganglia, it is one of the primary structures of the limbic brain. So your limbic system would be part of the brain that has mostly responsible for emotions and what it brings forth. It tends to be the part of the brain most responsible for automatic pilot behaviors, because what it's going to do, it focuses on routine behaviors and habits, and it works mostly without conscious thought, and kind of refeeds habits that you have established. So we talk about habits quite a bit here, but this is really the nitty-gritty of what's happening in the brain there. So there you're engaging when you're in a habit and automatic pilot, your basal ganglia. And as we mentioned, the prefrontal cortex uses an awful lot of energy. So your brain defaults to this system that uses far less energy. Because the more habits you have, if you remember from previous chats, the more habits you have, the more ingrained they are, the easier they are to retrace, and the less amount of energy your brain is going to use. So it can be difficult, and that's part of the reason why breaking these specific ways of thinking, of routine, of falling back into old ways can be so difficult, is because most of the time the prefrontal cortex, for whatever reason, goes offline. And it is very susceptible to a bad night's sleep, high stress levels. For those of you that listened to the cortisol talk this morning, which is available on the Ready Care Control YouTube page, the more stress that's in the system, the more cortisol that's in there, the lower your prefrontal cortex reasoning is going to be, because of that utilization of energy. The other thing is giving it good brain food. So when you are moving from the typical Western diet onto the oh, here we go. Deflated prefrontal cortex. There we go. My little tag there. Um, when you are moving from the typical Western diet with all the carbohydrates and the glucose, the new energy source that you will be fueling your brain, which is actually a lot easier for your brain to utilize, would be the likes of the ketones found from a fat adapted diet. So a mixture of good sleep and good energy source will help to mitigate some of the effects of a deflated prefrontal cortex, which can be things like poor cognitive reasoning, poor ability to look at a long-term effect of a specific decision, um, bad memory, bad adaptability to change, to learning, all of kind of the opposite of what I mentioned would be the positives of the prefrontal cortex being engaged. So it is quite susceptible to energy drainage. And again, sleep, very important to feed it. Feeding it ketones from a fat adapted diet as its primary fuel source would be another one. And then there are specific exercises that you can do to engage the prefrontal cortex. There are, there we go. There are specific proven methods. So one of the biggest ones would be to have aerobic exercise. So aerobic exercise not only reduces the cortisol, which messes with the ability of your prefrontal cortex to work, and actually enhances the basal ganglia, so that kind of threat response, that fear response, and habit response. High cortisol does that. So one of the ways to reduce the cortisol levels is to get a consistent aerobic exercise routine going in. I mentioned 120 minutes per week is kind of your minimum, but really it's 150 is kind of the new literature on that would be kind of more gearing towards 150. So aerobic exercises then would be kind of things like walking at a brisk pace, jogging, swimming, anything that gets your heart rate up slightly. There was a study published in 2019 in the Behavioral Sciences Journal, which looked at oxygen uptake, so that's aerobic exercises, in the prefrontal cortex during exercises. And the study compared the effects of low, moderate, and high intensity exercises. The result showed that the best cortical, so the prefrontal cortex oxygenation, was with moderate exercise. So nothing too mad, nothing, no sprinting up hills first thing in the morning, but really having your moderate amount of exercise is oxygenating the prefrontal cortex and energizing that aspect so that you are able to tap into all of the brilliant things that it can do with your reasoning, adaptability, executive functioning, all of the different parts. So mindfulness is another one that brings down cortisol levels, brings up endorphins, and brings the energy factor to the prefrontal cortex. So again, as I mentioned earlier today, mindfulness can show itself in lots of different ways for different people. It can be a 5 to 10 minute meditation that you practice, the old fashioned way, let's say, or it can be just bringing more awareness to a task that you're doing, like eating, walking, brushing your teeth, anything that lets you slow down, bring down the stresses a little bit, and bring up the endorphins, and that level of presence is exercising the prefrontal cortex. So you have to remember, with anything in the brain, repetition is key. The more you repeat an action, the easier it is to do. So if you've gone and you see specific patterns with yourself of going into more negative thought patterns, more negative emotional patterns, repeating certain actions that don't particularly serve you, and repeating certain habits from that kind of automatic pilot, basal ganglia stage that don't really serve you, it becomes more ingrained, it becomes more enmeshed. Now, the good news with that is that even if you find specific tasks difficult to do at the beginning, it isn't you. It's your physical makeup. It's part of your physiology that it is quite difficult because of that initial energy surge that's required to engage the prefrontal cortex to start to make decisions based on your long-term goals, what you want longer term, that's more aligned with who you choose to become. Now, another good way to exercise the old muscle is brain training games, um, which you can get digital versions, you can get apps, Sudoku, crosswords, specific puzzles. There's so many different games out there, especially for the phones, for brain training apps. Um, they have been shown to be an effective way to enhance cognitive functions performed by the frontal lobe and other areas of the brain. So again, a study done, I think it was the Medical Science Journal in 2018, looked at a study of 72 healthy young adults, um, and research assessed the effect of brain training games on several cognitive functions. So of the 72 participants, 51 performed training games for 15 minutes per day. That's all it is, 15 minutes per day. That's I was going to say that's waiting for the kettle to boil, but I think we've all evolved past those types of kettles. 7 days a week for 3 weeks only. So that was the length of the study. Quite a short study, but from that, the comparisons of the pre and post testing scores of the cognitive abilities, between the training group and control group. So control group being somebody who didn't take part in doing that 15 minutes a day. It demonstrated a significant improvement in speed, accuracy, working memory, which is a big one, attention to task, and global cognitive function in the training group. As many of those would be frontal lobe applications. So again, this is an idea that things are not set in stone. There's no fixed way with the brain. The brain will continuously change. And if there's any takeaway from most of most of the talks that I give, is that repetition is really key with the brain. The more you train it to do something, the easier it becomes, the more of an intrinsic reward it's going to find in that task. Um, so moving on then to practical applications. So having a look at ways that you can actively train. So we have the aforementioned, we have the exercise, we have the meditation, we have the brain training games. But one kind of little exercise that I would give in terms of giving yourself the best fighting chance with engaging your prefrontal cortex is, if you remember back to the start of the chat, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for forward planning, forward imagining. So when you find yourself in a specific scenario that you are finding yourself with a bit of resistance and slipping more and more into habits, a really simple way, super, 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 super simple way to engage the prefrontal cortex is to get the active imagination on board. And to do that, it's to take yourself out of the present situation where your brain is going to fight for habit, automatic pilot. We don't want to utilize energy. So it's doing all that in the background. So ask yourself, what would things be like if I always use this example. What would things be like if I did go to the gym every 3 times a week, let's say? How would things be different for me? Not in general in the world. How would things be different for me a year from now? So you're taking yourself out of the present situation and you're future forward projecting, and you're going to find it a lot easier once you really sit into that. So give your brain as much information as possible and really play around with that. Give yourself sensory information. If you're not sure where to go with your kind of active imagination, go for, what will I feel like? How would things be different for me physically, emotionally, psychologically? What would things be like in my everyday experience, in my interpersonal relationships? So you're giving yourself loads of material here to stir up the likes of your dopamine. It's our friend dopamine again. I have to have like what you call it? a bingo sheet of things that I mention every time. Dopamine, toop, toop, check. It's going to anchor your what the action that you want to do with the dopamine reward, and it's going to push you out of the basal ganglia into the prefrontal cortex, where you're able to make a decision based on what is for you, what's best for you long term, something that you want long term. Most of the time, if you put something into perspective that way, now it won't work. It won't work all the time. If there's a orange weather warning outside the window, and your task is to go running or bring the dog out, I know it can be a bit like, oh, I don't want to do that now. But most of the time, if you anchor um, any task that you really, really want onto a future projection. And you can play around with this actually. Like you can be a bit bold with yourself and go, okay, and what will things be like if I don't do it a year from now? What will things be like if I keep going the way that I'm going? So sink into, how will I feel? How will my interpersonal relationships be? What would my thoughts be like a year from now if I didn't engage in changing my diet positively? And sink into that and see, does that does that fit nicely for yourself? But there, by just asking yourself a simple future oriented question, you've brought the prefrontal cortex online. And you will find, if you engage in activities that exercise the muscle of the prefrontal cortex, making those types of decisions will become a lot easier for you. And you will find, like, think back any time that you've, whether it be you started a new job with specific processes that are different from what you were used to, or you learned a new language, or you learned anything new, or you adopted a new set of habits. It's always much more difficult in the beginning. The more you repeat it, the easier it gets. It's the same with most things in your brain. Honestly, most things in the brain can be simplified as repeat it often enough, and it becomes how you think, how you act, how you behave. Um, so that would kind of be the overview of the prefrontal cortex in terms of what it is that I mean when I mention the prefrontal cortex, how it can benefit you. So having your long-term goals established, really helping you with your memory, with your adaptability, with your learning, and with placing goals that are important for you long-term ahead of what's comfortable now. What's the habit? What's the basal ganglia acting up here? Um, if any of you would like more information on that and more ways to kind of stimulate those types of responses from yourself, drop me an old message at chloe.tetro@readycare.ie, and I can give you a kind of rounder series of questions to really start to take in with you. It really helps with motivation and setting yourself up for success in the best way possible. So that is me for this evening. If you guys have any questions you'd like to ask, please fire away. And I'll do the usual, give a few minutes at the end. If not, thank you so much for watching. And for those watching back, thank you so much for joining and watching back. Yeah, that is me. Few old seconds there for the old comment section. No, seems all good. And as I said, if you do want to contact me around this and kind of engaging specific parts of your brain to break out of habits, if you are finding kind of changes, no problem, Heather. No problem. Lovely. Thanks for joining. If you do want more information, please don't hesitate to contact me. Have a lovely Thursday evening, lads. It's getting cold out there. So snuggle up and we'll chat to you later. Oh, Andrew will be back next week and we'll chat to you then. Bye.